There was an opinion piece. Media coverage of Ukraine shows it's time to rethink what we know about Africa. And it's mostly focusing on just all the various examples of how the news, frames the Ukraine situation as sort of like this unique or especially concerning situation, which just feels weird for a country that's coming out of a 20-year war in the Middle East and who is dealing with a constant migrant, immigration, refugee type crisis on our southern border that we frame in often the most disgusting ways possible. But anyway, I just wanted to see kind of what folks' reactions were, thoughts were. I think it's obviously, thoughts, prayers, whatever, go out to Ukraine. Hopefully we can avoid, nuclear war and the insanity of escalation beyond the point of humanity's survival. But really, I think the Ukraine situation is kind of from like a media analysis, is like an interesting look at kind of how we talk about things in the news and how that is often deeply racist and troubling.
Deeply racist and troubling.
I think like the first thing, right off the bat, over here at OPN, like we are generally anti-war in all sorts of ways and support like demilitarization as a whole. But we're not going to stay neutral whenever an entire country is trying to invade another country altogether. Like that's just wrong. Um, the big thing though is, I'll say this: um, the American perspective of non-American um, situations portrayed in media has generally been piss poor. And I say that to just say like, they're like first and foremost, a lot of folks, especially in this country, come in with the perception of like America is like the best place on the freaking planet, and like every other country that exists has no idea or isn't even like holds a candle to where we are. So we're already starting off with like this perspective like of a superiority complex from the get go. And number two, I think while a lot of this conversation has been focused on, as some people like to call it, the Ukraine, it's just Ukraine. Um, Really, we don't talk enough about who the actual oppressor in the situation is, which is Russia. And I think for us, like we're seeing, and folks who are older than us, like a lot of our elders, who come from a lot of like these backgrounds where they've seen war or the U.S. been in war. My parents, right? They come from like a country that's not even a whole 100 years old, like 1971 was the birth of Bangladesh, maybe off by a few years. But they've seen war too, and that gets passed on to like their kids and like the people around them, and they're familiar, and they're just like it's just not a good situation for absolutely anybody. Like nobody involved is winning in this circumstance. But what and I mean, and let's just tension of it is because Western media does put its lens on Europe because that's the closest thing to their cousins that they see. What about my cousins? I'm talking about like places like Libya, like North Africa. We're talking about places like Palestine, where the state of Israel is literally having this conversation of like we will build more homes for Ukrainian refugees to come live here. Which I'm just like that sounds all fine and dandy, except for the people that you're kicking off the land in order to do that in the first place. Like at that point, like you're just trying to cover up one problem with like, dressing up and painting it. And so this situation is, not to say that it's not unique because this has like seismic, um, like consequences across the world, being that like we're dealing with one of the largest superpowers on the planet. Um, but it's really showing like our true colors. Like if America is capable of saying like we want to accept refugees from absolutely everywhere, especially Ukraine, like we're talking about 44 million people who have the potential to be displaced, then we need to say that for everybody too.
Yeah, yeah.
So So many good points, Taz, especially when we talk about Ukrainian displacement because, okay, even there were 1.5 million people already displaced within Ukraine before everything that happened because of the invasion that happened in 2014. And so now we're about to see an outrageous number. I can't remember if it was. I was trying to figure out if it was 50,000 or 500,000. But either way, that's a lot of people for a country whose population is only 44 million people. Like, this is crazy. And then we see with Syria, like how many people have been displaced in Syria. They've been at civil war for like 11 years. More than half their country is food insecure. How long can we let things like this happen? How long are we gonna sit by and let things like this happen as the richest country in the world? We have motherfuckers in our country right now who could end world hunger and just choose not to and still be billionaires. Like that's what infuriates me. Like, yeah, okay, we have, power hungry Vladimir Putin over here, but there are people who actually are suffering and could be getting helped, but they're not because capitalism and selfish motherfuckers. And you had talked about like the superiority complex of kind of like the West. There's a really good book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and it's basically about history since like the beginning of humanity, but told not from the point of view of the West. Because when we tell our history, it's like, oh, all of these countries that we go into were all uncivilized and they were savages until we gave them modern technology. But I think Papua New Guinea was one of the countries they focused on a lot in the book and was saying how like their society was extremely civilized versus what we would have been made to think. And so it's just like that superiority complex is bullshit. It's all from, one, white supremacy, and it stems from where you come from. Because right now, if you were to go put me in a jungle or in a rainforest somewhere versus someone who's been there their whole life, I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. So that superiority complex is bullshit. Like, everyone deserves to just be able to live. Like, it also, on the media tip, if you're only watching American news, you're not watching the news. I had an international politics professor, shout out to Dr. Emily Stacy, tell me that. And it changed my life. Like when I started actually watching things like, BBC and Al Jazeera and paying attention to like the news in the countries that, things are happening in or surrounding those countries, because I'm not saying that the, state-run media is the best, but it makes a big difference. And I want to shout out to all the independent journalists. I wish I had a list. I should have prepared a list. But there are a lot of independent journalists who are risking their lives right now to cover what's going on in Ukraine. And you can follow them on Instagram. You can follow them on Twitter. Find their Cash Apps. Donate to them, because these are people literally risking their lives and ready to die to report the news and show what's going on. So shout out
I'd like
to
to make a
them.
recommendation of like, of course, everybody has heard of Al Jazeera at some point, but just looking at some more international bases, there's this group. It's called WION, which is the World is One News, that examines global issues from across the planet. They're based out of New Delhi, but honestly, some of the best journalism I have ever seen. Just and that's also just from like their reporters as well. Like the delivery of their content is very true, like, and very honest, um, without it seeming like you're playing like partisanship. Because, and that's the other thing too, I want to say too, in this country, in America especially, like you do get to see what like political tendencies look like for a lot of different media outlets. When it's international, a lot of that gets taken out. So that's my recommendation. And Good talking, right?
Thanks for watching our video. Please give it a like and hit that subscribe button for more content. If you want to engage with us, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, and Instagram.